This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. Over time, religious affiliation and weekly religious service attendance have declined significantly. From a 2000 to 2003 data set, so surveys conducted over that 4-year period, 42% of Americans attended religious services weekly or almost weekly, and just 9% of Americans claimed no religious affiliation. Fast forward 2 decades, and those numbers had changed. 30% of Americans attended religious services weekly or almost weekly, and 21% claimed no religious affiliation. So that's a 12% move in both directions. Now, prior to the early 2000s, there really hadn't been much change since the early 1970s. Service attendance peaked around 50% in the late 1950s, then dropped steadily to 40% in the early 70s, where it stuck for 3 decades before dropping again. Now, there is some evidence that trends are starting to reverse, or at least, the downward trend line has flattened. If we look at Christians alone, so in 2007, 78% of Americans identified as Christians. That had dropped to 63% in 2019. So that's a 15% drop in just 12 years. And 61% in 2022, but then back up to 63% in 2024. So, we're seeing at least, a halt in the downward trend, maybe a flattening, maybe a resurgence. And anecdotally, you start to talk to people, and this is something I'm going to talk about with my guest today, but, we are starting to see resurgences, at least in certain places. Now, this drop in religious affiliation has happened at the same time that public trust in the government has cratered. So since 1958, Pew has been asking people whether they trust the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time. That number peaked in 1964 under President Johnson with a moving average of 77%, which from today's perspective is pretty incredible. Then fell as Vietnam escalated and continued to fall, hitting 27% during Carter's last year in office. The peak in the period since was 54% during the aftermath of 9/11, but then fell again. And under Trump 1 and Biden, it was around 20%, slightly under for Trump, slightly over for Biden. I think one of the fundamental questions of our time isn't just how we stop this drop in institutional trust, but how we reverse it. Religion is just part of the story, but it is a real part of it. And that's why I'm happy today to be joined by Griffin Gooch, who is an almost fully trained Christian theologian, getting his doctorate at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Gooch teaches at North Point College in Michigan and writes regularly and well on 3 separate Substacks. So we got Reality Theology with Griffin Gooch. This is the one where you do most of the writing, I think.
Yeah.
The others, there's a bit more publishing, other writers. Okay. But Reality Theology with Griffin Gooch, where his aim is to connect academic disciplines that try to describe reality, so psychology, sociology, philosophy, personal development, artistic studies, and so on, with a theological worldview. The Remarkable Ordinary, which publishes ordinary stories of Christian kindness, hospitality, and integrity, and aims to provide an anti-moral failure, anti-church scandal, anti-Christian hypocrisy journalism. And then finally, The Deadly Seven, which is a limited series that ran during this year's Lent on the 7 deadly sins, which are, of course, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. So very happy today to be joined by Griffin Gooch. Griffin, welcome.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Based on that intro, I mean, you are not a particularly slothful person, I would say. Based on, that's a lot of content. That's a lot of product. But anyway, I asked you on today because I wanted to talk about this. You know, I wanted to talk to someone who uh, I don't know if you would self-identify as a religious expert, but certainly compared to me, I would call you a religious expert, and I think
I'm sure you're fine.
this is something that you have obviously dedicated a whole lot of time to learning about. And so I thought you'd be a good person to talk to. But before we get to these big questions, why the decline and what to make of it and what to make of a possible flattening in the downward trend or resurgence, wanted to get a better sense on your background personally. So my understanding is that, okay, well, actually, just take me through it. Take me through your
Okay.
religious journey, because in addition to writing about it, you are personally a religious person and you're open about it. And I would love to hear your story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised in an evangelical church, but we weren't super involved growing up or anything like that. We would kind of just go Christmas, Easter, and then maybe just a few other weekends throughout the year. We weren't super involved, and it wasn't really real to me for the most part, even from when I was pretty young. And then when I was around the age of 13, I became just a full blown atheist. I was just very nihilistic, just for whatever reason. That was just the way that my personality bent. I didn't trust any of it, and just even just seeing the way that people acted within church, I just lost faith in it because I was like, I don't see any correspondence between the way that these people are acting in church and the way that Jesus actually presents himself in the
Yeah.
Bible. So became full blown atheist
Can
by
I
the time that I
can I
was
drill
13.
can I drill down on that a little bit? So
Yeah,
13,
absolutely.
and you're talking about this atheism coming from, so you're seeing people at church that like, yeah, okay, this is kind of the Christian hypocrisy that we see in the Remarkable Ordinary.
Yeah.
Um, or see the opposite of that anyway. But so, like Christian hypocrisy, were you reading anything? This is so you're pretty young. You're I think 27 years old,
Yeah.
and so you are coming of religious age in a period where we do have a lot of anti-theism. You got
Yeah.
Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and Harris who are writing. Was it any of that, or was it just like you personally? You're at church and like, yeah, I don't buy it.
No, it's so funny. Because it would make sense if it was like the four horsemen of the apocalypse or whatever they were called, the four atheists of the apocalypse. I can't remember, like Hitchens and Dawkins and all those
Yes,
guys. But no,
anti-theists.
it was
Yeah,
actually it was actually just music. When I was young, I was really into all these like I don't know, nihilistic '90s bands, and then like modern rappers like Tyler the Creator and whatnot. And all of the so many of the people that I was listening to were just atheistic, and they seemed more like
yeah,
authentic, more real than most of the people that I knew that were coming around church. And so it wasn't this like crazy philosophical deconstruction or anything like that, but it was just like I respect these musicians or artists more than I respect like a local church pastor. So no like lofty
no
story there or
kidding.
anything like that.
That's okay. So that's really interesting. That is not what I would have guessed. But now that you say it,
Yeah,
it's like,
no.
oh yeah, okay. But then, okay, so you're this committed atheist for a number of years, but then that starts to change at some point.
Yes, yes. So I got pretty into like drugs and like art and just experimenting with just life and different philosophies and stuff like that. I did actually get into philosophy after I had deconstructed, and it wasn't necessarily before
Mm.
that or whatever. But then by the time that I was 18, I got arrested and put in jail. And during the Sunday of my stay in jail, there was a group of preachers who came in and they started sharing the gospel, and I left the jail cell and I listened to it, and the words that I had heard growing up so many times that were just fell flat and were just totally fake, I saw authentically and real in these people who had like come into jail to share the gospel. And so in that moment I just accepted it. I mean, I was just like rushed with tears and just overcome with yeah, just Jesus, the Holy Spirit, everything. Like, and so from that moment I
Yeah.
accepted Jesus into my heart, the whole like evangelical conversion type thing. And from the moment that I got out, I just got plugged into a local campus ministry from where I was living at the time. And then from that moment on, I was just I decided that I was going to just give my entire life to Jesus, no matter what it would take necessarily. And so I just wanted to vocationally, career wise, in everything that I do, just follow that path.
No kidding. That
Yeah.
okay. Wow. Okay, so you at the time, where were you living? Where were you going to
Uh,
college?
this was in Big Rapids, Michigan, which is a very
Okay.
small town.
I haven't. So Big Rapids is different from Big Rapids is different from Grand Rapids, I
Yes, much
guess.
smaller.
All right. Okay. Okay, so you're in Big Rapids, Michigan. You have this, this powerful conversion experience in jail. And now obviously there are tens of thousands of Christian denominations from which one might choose or, into which one might direct oneself. How did you end up where you're at? Where are you at and how did you end up there?
I think you would technically put me under the Pentecostal branch of the evangelical church. So essentially, just a
Mhm.
charismatic Christian, somebody who believes that the Holy Spirit is still living and active. But that's such a broad umbrella so that it's kind of hard to describe what it is even more specifically than that. And even under the
Yeah.
Pentecostal branch, like the modern strain of it right now, it's become so influenced by different aspects of the church or different periods or even thoughts or philosophies or traditions within church history itself that it's starting to morph and like look a little bit different than it did classically. So it's not necessarily just a bunch of people like screaming and speaking in tongues and then falling over in their seats. Like it's, it's become something almost just transformed in a sense to kind of meet the needs of the time in a way. So
Mm,
the church that I'm kind of involved in now, it's very spirit driven, but it's also intellectual at the same time. We call it spirit and truth. And so that's kind of the tradition that I
mm,
love to operate in, is whereas I really do believe that God and the Holy Spirit are extremely active in this day and age. But also at the same time, I want to balance all of that out with a lot of reading and learning and philosophizing and trying to understand what our faith actually is, not just in a myopic religious sense of like only looking at the Bible, but you're trying to look at like all of history, all knowledge, see what corresponds to this and what is true from there.
yeah. That's really interesting. And so you're a doctoral student at the University of
Yeah.
Aberdeen in Scotland. So one, how'd you end up going to school in Scotland? And then two, within the Pentecostal tradition, are you in the minority there among doctoral theological students? And final question, so it's three questions, sorry. What
Okay.
what is the goal? Is it like after you finish your doctorate, do you become a full-time professor and pastor? What's the end?
Well, I wish I had updated you about this beforehand, but I'm not actually in Scotland. I only attend school in there, so I'm still technically in Michigan, just in a other city called Kalamazoo.
Right.
So sorry, very sorry about that. That's
Got it.
totally my bad. But anyways,
No, no,
in
no,
my
no.
yeah, in my doctoral student body right now, I do feel a little different, but not that much. I mean, my advisor seems pretty much on
Yeah.
board with everything that's like I say or mention, talk about. Some of the other
Yeah.
students might not want to go as like charismatic or active or I mean, hopeful about God still being active in our reality at this moment as I would. But in general, it's not in even in
Mhm.
the slightest like hostile, not remotely um, what do you removed from how I understand it. It's very nice
Yeah.
and very cohesive. And then in long term
Yeah.
goals, I just would love to be a professor. I feel like that's just what I'm called to. So I'm just trying to be a professor, hopefully do a lot of research on the side, and just try to be some form of a light and a gift to those that I'm around in whatever university I end up in.
That's awesome. All right. Well, in Kalamazoo, there's no problem with you being in Kalamazoo. That, of course, is the home of Derek Jeter. So,
Yes,
you know, that's
100%. Yeah,
there we
yeah.
go. So that's the connection for a lot of people that don't know Michigan very
Oh, I
well.
know.
Um,
Yeah.
so let's get to man, that's really interesting. Let's get to your views on this. So, we've had this decline in religious attendance, all that. broadly speaking, what do you make of it? Like, what started it? Why would it potentially be pausing now?
Yeah, so I mean, what you described in there is extremely interesting, and I wasn't totally aware of all of those trends, but I find it very fascinating just in the sense that, if we're just thinking about American history, right? So, like, American history, looking at the broad span of church attendance, I mean, we had a huge spike in church attendance after the Civil War, and then I think the biggest spike in church attendance ever after World War II. And then after World
Hmm.
War II, and around that time, I think there was this missiologist named Leslie Newbigin, who he was a missionary off in very I can't remember exactly where it was right now off the top of my head, but when he was a missionary for many years, he came back to America and he kind of saw the trends that were happening in this like post-war era of church attendance, and he was noticing that there was this
Yeah.
huge interest and infatuation with politics and things like that. And then especially like people who were sort of had one foot in the church and one foot outside of the church, they were incredibly infatuated with what was going on in politics, so much so that they stopped paying attention to what was happening in the church and more attention to actually how can we move things and make things happen within um, the political arena rather than just our local level church, area and things along those
Hmm.
lines. So he warned people. He was like, if you actually let God go and you start following politics, politics is going to be your new religion. And so, in a lot of ways, after this post 1950s era with this huge church boom, we saw a lot of people really committed to politics as this new religion, right? And so, I think we might have seen like the apex of that somewhere around like the 2010s or whatever. I can't remember what year it was specifically, but I remember reading that one of the typically like conservatives for whatever reason, I mean, there are a lot of historic reasons to it, but typically conservatives will attend church in much larger numbers than liberals for the most
Hmm.
part. And Christianity is more typically associated with conservatism. But around the 2010s, there was this very weird trend where conservatives actually stopped going to church, and a lot of it was related directly to this rise in like a political ideology and whatnot. So whereas conservatives would typically just attend church on a Sunday because it was what they did, well, in this new era, around the
Hmm.
2010s, politics became like the new religion for both the left and the right, but especially for the right. But I think what we're seeing more recently is actually the people who did leave the church putting all their eggs in the basket of politics, realizing that that view is somewhat bankrupt and doesn't have a lot of life and joy and beauty to offer in itself, and can't necessarily
Hmm.
create a huge transforming inward sense of uh, Christ likeness or whatever you want to call it. I think there was this huge dissatisfaction with it, and especially for their kids, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, the kids who were put out of church when their parents stopped going or whatever, their kids now were raised without church, without any institution, without any sort of communal backgrounds, giving them a larger moral framework to inhabit. And so once they grew up and they started realizing that there's not much out there for them, politics is
Hmm.
it's fun. It can it can definitely create change here and there if you use it well, but it's not a good
Yeah.
container for human identity. I mean, it's not enough of a container for human identity as something like, religion, of faith, and something that transcends ourselves. And so, especially with Gen Z, and I think the statistics for Gen Alpha are starting to become even better than the statistics for Gen Z,
Yeah.
but they're starting to come to church so much more. I mean, they're attending church more than millennials and Gen X right now, which is amazing and kind of
Yeah.
insane. And so what I see it is like these kids who were raised without much of a story, they've now been given a story to like be a part of, and they find that attractive and they want to move towards it naturally. But following all these trends from America throughout the past like century, this is kind of a logical culmination of all of those things, because we go out into
Yeah.
the world and see that the things of the world, politics or sensual pleasures or anything like that, are not necessarily super fulfilling. They don't have a larger narrative for us to be a part of. Once we see that those things
Yeah.
aren't necessarily fulfilling, we then actually fall back on the things that are fulfilling, the things that will actually give rest to our restless hearts.
That is okay. So there's a lot there. That's really interesting. So, you know, uh, underpinning a lot of that, you're talking about a crisis of meaning. And,
Yeah.
where you have this kind of generation over generation, loss of meaning. If we look at it, kind of the way we talk about it a lot is like a crisis of community. Where for a long time, churches, synagogues, other religious institutions, they provide like the backbone of a community where everyone gets
Yeah.
involved, and that can give you some meaning, and then you have the story behind it, and then as you shed that, you have to find some sort of replacement for it, and if you don't, eventually, maybe we see the trends reverse. Where
Yeah.
do you think that's a fair characterization of what you're saying? I actually
Yeah,
kind of lost where I was going with
absolutely.
it, but yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I just remember this, the whatever their name is, the 4 horsemen of the
Yeah,
atheist apocalypse. Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, whatever they were called. We should have looked this up beforehand. But anyways, so I remember Richard Dawkins, I mean, he was so against Christianity for so many years, but then when he saw the
yeah,
rise of, political, radicalism or jingoism or whatever you wanna call it, when he saw the rise of
yeah,
that, he realized that this was almost becoming a bigger problem than the conservative Christianity that he was lashing out against. And so
yeah.
somewhere this was somewhere in the past few years, but he started saying like church is actually a good thing for society. It is a
Did he really?
backbone for civilization, which is so
Yeah,
funny because I mean he's spent so many
yeah,
years. I mean he would take out bus ads and billboards and stuff to try
yeah,
to say point out why Christianity was so false and so fake. But now he's actually
yeah,
seeing something that's almost worse, which is like, which is essentially like this political ideology that's trying to create a kingdom without the king. And so he's seeing that
yeah.
and it's like, all right, that's actually worse. I'm not going to believe in God, but we can keep these churches because they're at least providing something good and moral in the background.
That's so funny because it is kind of this fundamental issue. I've thought, as a religious person, like being okay. Let's put it this way: there is a difference between being religious and believing in God. The percentage of people that are fundamentally religious, and I'm using that in quotes, is much larger than the percentage of people that believe in God. The percentage of people that believe in God might be very high, but I think percentage of people
Yeah.
that are religious have a kind of a religious attitude to things, that it's higher. And so,
Yeah.
you'll see in places where religion is you know oppressed by the state, somehow it's pushed down. You'll see other things rise to take its place that are not necessarily improvements. So,
Yeah.
you'll see either a religious like devotion to the state or to some ethnicity or to and we do see that with political parties to a greater extent than we'd like, but I think still probably a lesser extent that we see it in some other countries. But it marrying, and this, it's kind of funny because this touches on my personal issues with theocracies, but when you
Yeah.
marry kind of that religious devotion and whatnot with the power of the state, I think you can run into a whole lot of issues, and that gets off to a
Yeah.
separate thing. But so that's, man, that's really, yeah, that's really interesting. Oh, Dawkins. I I I actually, I was a big fan of Hitchens, and of Dawkins too. But okay, so with this decline, because I want to get to, I want to drill down a little more on the reasons for the decline in church attendance. Because
Yeah.
so some of it, let's say, is just people like they start mixing the religious and the political, and they become more attached to the politics over time, or something like that. It is, but you've talked about your own experience seeing hypocrisy and whatnot. Like, were there any issues in these institutions that drove people away?
Oh, within the churches themselves?
Yeah, or yeah, writ
Oh, yeah.
large.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things about church is there's not one on the entire planet that's gonna do everything perfectly. You know, they make tons of mistakes,
Right.
like, constantly, really, and, I think one of the issues is that when we're raised in such a cynical age where we do just naturally distrust people so much, we might come to church just for one Sunday, and we might see, like, just one worship leader say something that didn't feel authentic or didn't feel real or didn't feel natural. And then that one instance, we can just take that and let our cynicism run wild and be like, the entire church itself is not worth attending. Because I saw this one person who modeled a hypocrite to me right now. And so, in my personal assessment, I
Yeah.
now doubt that this is something that we should go to. And so, there is always just going to naturally be churches that um, fall short in this way. I mean, every single church is going to fall short in one way or another. But one of the things that I find to be interesting and different for just the younger generation is that they're finding ways to say or to notice the things that they should be cynical about. You know, just the stuff that is,
Hmm.
I mean, less than flattering, stuff that doesn't seem that great. And they're finding ways just to look past it, to be like, I just want to worship. I just want to pray. I just want to be involved. I want to sit under a teacher. I want to learn from them. I want to take communion. All of these just natural things. They're finding little tiny ways just to say, I see it. I see the problems in it, but I actually want to look past it and I want to find beauty in it because I don't find beauty elsewhere. And so I think this is the
Yeah.
closest place for it.
What do you think makes this age cynical, and what made prior ages less cynical?
Oh man. Um, well, I mean, in my assessment, I think it's just a huge wave of postmodern philosophy that was very rampant amongst like well, I mean, it was a lot of philosophers both in Europe and here, but especially over like the second half of the 20th century and everything like that. But I mean, before the second half of the 20th century, the post-war era and everything like that, we were essentially a modernist nation, right? So modernist is like,
Hmm.
you'd almost call it like the American spirit, where it's like, you know, patriotism and just like values and working hard, picking yourself up by your bootstraps, being a strong, courageous person. Like that was just a model of the type of person that you wanted to embody. So you wanted to imbibe this
Hmm.
sense of just duty, of natural courage and bravery and things like that. So that was like the modernist American spirit. But then after that, you have postmodernists, you know, people like Derrida, Foucault, you know, these guys. So they start to cast doubt on that entire American spirit, not just the American spirit itself, but just all narratives everywhere, right? So
Hmm.
one of like the basic theses of postmodernism is that you cannot trust meta narratives. There is no grand unifying narrative to whatever we are experiencing. Therefore, there is no larger story to be a part of. And therefore, if you are going to be a good soldier or a good person within a postmodern framework, your job is now to deconstruct and take down every thing that is trying to be a narrative, show it for what it is, show the cynicism, the hypocrisy for what it is, and then reveal that to others. And then that is your essentially your duty. Okay, so it's inherently
Hmm.
distressful. It's not. It's a system without hope. It's very nihilistic, and so that spirit really embedded itself, especially into the arts. And so we see that all over the place, especially within music. As if you listen to like '90s grunge, that's like Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins, like all those kind of bands. I mean, they really embedded this sense of like postmodern. We're not going to fall victim to the corporations and what they want us to do. We're not going to fall victim to these American stories. We're going to unveil those things for what they are and live our own way, right? And so it also bled into our
Hmm.
movies, our media, everything. And so with all of that stuff, you know, there's uh, it, and it's kind of funny because these movements, they don't really take place much within like politics or law, which is where you would think that most of the major movements in world history come from. But it's basically just happening within our songs, within our TV shows, within our movies, and everything like that. It's just these slowly embedded stories that nothing really matters, that church is a lie, that the government is trying to deceive you, that any institution that is not that you aren't running personally is probably trying to get under your skin in one way or another and trick you. And so once that's just imbibed into your, I mean, it's almost like in all of our nervous systems or limbic systems now
Yeah.
at this point, that inherently distrust any like show or advertisement that we see. Just be like, they're lying, they're after something that's not um, for me or anything like that. Like it's not serving
Yeah.
um, my authentic self or whatever you want to call it. And so once that's just embedded into everything, that starts taking over the way that we see the world. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's been so hard to trust churches in general, is because they're like the
Hmm.
scapegoated they're like the scapegoat faces of everything that postmodernism hates. It's like this pastor
Right.
who's genuinely trying to promote love and peace and joy. I mean, that's again,
Mm.
that opposes everything that they're after. And so it inherently just gets under their skin. And so it just seems like religiosity, communities that are surrounded by moral values, all of those things are just so fully opposed to what is best for society and what is best for society. In their worldview is just deconstructing most things.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Okay, and so I listened to you, give another interview where you talked about metamodernism. That
Oh
is
yeah.
not a term I had previously heard. What is metamodernism?
All right. So I got that definitely from this guy named Paul Antleiter. Antleitner.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I've actually never pronounced his name out loud. So if he hears this,
That
I'm sorry.
happens to me all the time when I'm recording. I realize that I have this name and I'm gonna say it, and then I realize, "Oh, I've never said this before." And
Oh
then,
no,
just butcher it.
dude,
It's
it's
yeah.
tough.
No, it's
Yeah.
yeah.
But anyways, this guy, Paul Ann Leitner, he's
Mhm.
really been introducing these concepts of metamodernism into evangelical spaces, which I think has really helped put a lot of language to what we're experiencing right now and what a lot of Gen Z is experiencing right now specifically. But I think you can
Mhm.
technically trace it back to this writer. I mean, he was most famously a novelist, but his name was David Foster Wallace, and
Yeah.
he was
Okay.
yeah, yeah, amazing philosopher, but most people just think of him as a novelist. But he had these ideas about where the world was heading because of postmodernism, where he would look at a lot of the fiction, a lot of the movies, and a lot of the music and stuff that was happening around his day back in the 90s, back when like grunge rock or Fight Club or whatever was coming out. And so he would
Yeah.
analyze that and he would say, you realize that at the end of like the movie Fight Club or the movie Blue Velvets, the David Lynch movie, you realize at the end of that movie they just blow up a building and watch it burn down. Like that's the resolution of the movie. There's nothing there, and so he
Yeah.
was just noticing that like within the philosophical academic community within the novelist community, within all of these different communities, they were coming to a point where they were finding all of these stories compelling where there was no actual sentiment in it whatsoever. They resisted
Yeah.
sentimentality, they resisted sincerity. And so David Foster Wallace wrote this amazing essay, E Unibus Plurum, or E Pluribus Unum. I think he switches it around.
Mm.
So whatever it normally is, he does it the other way. But anyways, he just
Okay.
argues that we need a sense of sincerity or else we are going to fall apart. We need somebody to be brave and stand up and actually write a story knowing full well of all of these postmodern critiques, all these um, like just writing something as simple as a story where a family goes through a struggle and then at the end of the story the family is all together and happy, thankful that they came through the story all in one piece, right? So something like that would bore somebody who is from a postmodernist framework because that would be like supporting a family system or supporting truth that transcends um, the structures that they were looking at or whatever. But David Foster Wallace would look at that and say that is actually bravery. So if to
Mhm.
understand all of the pitfalls of postmodernism, to understand that there are so many people out there who are hypocritical and who you can distrust and sometimes you even should distrust, to understand all of those realities and yet at the same time commit yourself to a framework in which you value real sentiments, real emotion, real beauty beyond all of these other concerns, right? So that was what he was after, right? And so that is essentially basically what meta modernism is, where it is aware of all of the cynical things that you can go through. It's aware of all of the pitfalls that a church pastor might have, and they display an awareness of those things. But rather than saying let's just give up, it says no, I'm going to continue fighting for what is good in spite of those things. I get that people can be distrustworthy. I get that some pastors have moral failures. But in spite of all of those things, I'm going to pursue something true. Because if I do not pursue something that is true and good and beautiful, I will not end up a person of truth, of goodness, and of beauty. Right. And so
Mhm.
that was just my that was just my summary of a lot of Paul Antleder's work, but it's so good. I'm so just passionate about that, but I see this so much in
Yeah.
Generation Z, especially the people that we listen to. I mean, we have a lot of these pastors like John Mark Comer and John Tyson. These are two huge pastors among Gen Z. And one of the things that's very
Yeah.
interesting about these figures is that in their sermons, they will mention stuff about like, they'll make a joke about how like, oh, since I'm a pastor, you might think I'm a cult leader or something like that, but I promise I'm not gonna, take your debit cards or whatever, right? So it's just a
Hmm.
dumb little joke, but it's just in the very in the very display of that joke. It shows people that it's like, oh, this person actually understands the cynical perspective that we might be having, but in spite of him understanding that the cynical perspective that we might be having, he's choosing to still be a pastor, to still give a sermon about the importance of loving our neighbor. He knows all the pitfalls and all the what's wrong with humanity, but in spite of all those things, they're still choosing to try to be a person of love and joy and peace, and to try to get others to do that as well, which is amazing. So, like, yeah, I mean, that's just an
Yeah.
example of how metamodernism would play out.
That's what it sounds like to me is it's like, so with modernism, you have some baby and you have some bathwater. And postmodernism is like, okay, we're going to take this apart. We're going to look, okay, and we're going to lose the baby is what really happened, I think, in practice. But it's like you're getting rid of the baby so you can get rid of the bathwater. And then a metamodernism, as I understand it from that, what was an excellent and I thought compelling description, is we recognize the bathwater. We see it. We are aware of it. We are aware of modernism's failures or potential failures or whatnot. But we also see the good there, and we think that good is worth fighting for, and that it's important to fight for that good despite the bathwater. It's like
Yes.
postmodernism ultimately leads to the burned down building.
Yeah. You
Uh,
said it in like 30 seconds, and I took like 10 minutes or
no,
something like that. That was great.
no, it is really interesting because I think this is helpful because it gets to this fundamental idea. Because I like looking at this from, you know, I, I attend church, but I am certainly not a theologian. I am not dedicating my life to teaching theology or learning more about theology. And I write about politics and I think about it more through a political lens. And the trust, the decline in trust for institutions, I think, really troubles me. Because ultimately, in the United States, especially, we're talking about, a democracy where the government works, because it has the consent of the governed, and once you lose that consent, you run into some serious issues. And it it just, a system like this just works a lot better if people do trust the government to do the right thing or to try to do the right thing. And that trust remained high during modernism. If we go back to the first half of the 20th century, we see relatively high levels of trust, despite the fact that the government was often not doing the right thing and was
Yeah.
often messing up pretty badly.
Yeah.
And in domestically and abroad, like, the government was really swinging and missing in some pretty material respects. And then, all that comes out, or a lot of it comes out. And so people, I think, naturally and justifiably, lose trust in these institutions. And you've seen it with, in religion too, where you've had some major figures, either major individual figures have had scandals of some sort, or, churches. Obviously, the Catholic Church had a major sex abuse scandal, and we've
Yeah.
seen echoes of that pretty much everywhere, not just in churches, but wherever there are adult authority figures that are put in kind of shepherding roles over young people.
Yeah.
It's like most of the time it's great and sometimes it's really not.
Yeah.
And so it, the taking this back to the central idea, it's like you've seen this very justifiable or very, very reasonable decline in trust, but society does not work nearly as well without the trust. And so the question then becomes, how do you restore that trust now that everyone knows that the emperor is naked, or whatever, the emperor's new clothes or not,
Yeah. No,
like,
that's great.
and I like that idea, that you're talking to John Mark Comer. I know you recently wrote a long article on him and these pastors, and I'm not sure I've really seen a political analog for that. I think we're
Mhm.
still, to a great degree on both sides, kind of in tear down mode. And
Yeah,
it's like, you tear down as long as the other party is control, and then you get in, and it's like, why are we tearing down, guys? Like we
yeah.
like we
Oh,
this,
man.
and I'm not sure, still not sure how to reverse that. I realize that's kind of sounds, uh, I don't know. We need maybe we need some really charismatic, broadly appealing figures
Yeah.
rather than figures that are simply appealing to their own side.
Man,
Um,
you are so right, though. That is not any I've not seen any figures in the political arena who've imbibed some sort of just sense of hope or I don't or even just having somebody who would say, "I don't care if I put down the other side, I just want what's best for the world or the country." I really have not seen that.
yeah.
It's
No, and the thing is, like, you listen to their speeches, and everyone on both sides will occasionally argue just that. That it's like, this is, we're just doing what's best for America, but they don't really do it usually without accompanying that with some pretty venomous invective for the other side,
yeah,
or saying that we're going to do what's best for America, but then the what's best for America is their specific vision of things, and any deviation from that, it's like we gotta stamp that out. And I don't
yeah,
think that this is where I think we see, politics and religion kind of becoming this, or the religious approach to politics, where it becomes a sort of syncretic religion, where uh, it like to so let's look at this, like levels of identity. It's like, religion, once it whatever your religious beliefs are, but especially if you are an actively religious person, it's like that's a fundamental part of your identity. And though you might remain a curious person, and though you might engage with perspectives that are either different from your own or go against your own, for the most part, you're going to be very protective about the truths that you believe. We can put that
yeah,
in quotes or not in quotes. And I think, honestly, I think with religion, that's fine. Like, when you have something, especially when it's not married with state power, like if that is comes with, a respect for other people's right to do the same thing, it's like that's great.
yeah,
Where you have that problem with politics, I think, is it like if you take a religious view of politics and you are no longer engaging with other perspectives, no longer engaging with other people, and you're dismissing them out of hand because they have, taken an evil approach or whatever. And then you also combine that with the fact that you might control, like, the enforcement arm of the state. Like, you can really run into, I think, some dangerous issues.
yeah.
Um, do you have any thoughts on that as a as a as a professor and theologian?
Well, I mean, I think you're exactly right. When identity does get roped into those different categories, things that aren't necessarily a good enough scaffolding to uphold them. I mean, it's so
Mm,
natural for your actual identity or your beliefs, your values, even the ambitions that you say that you have, just to get subsumed into a political agenda, and then, I mean, one of the one of the funniest things, well, I mean, it's not funny, it's actually pretty depressing, but, when when people's identities do get really locked up into, one political aisle, like,
mhm,
I like, if on Substack tomorrow I just became really far right or far left, it would
mm.
alienate some, but it would gain a ton of new different followers or whatever that would support you.
Oh, yeah.
But then
Oh,
once
yeah.
you're in there, it's very interesting that every little thing that you would do or you could say, you could sort of engineer it in a sense to give you more status. So it's like
Mm,
I mean, there's like what 15 topics that both of these sides are always arguing about. Well, it's like you could just take any of
mhm.
those 15 topics, come up with a very radical stance on them, and then and try to say it in like an interesting way. Put it out as a tweet or a note or a post or whatever, and then just every time you do that, you just like it's a little bit of status play. It's like you're raising your status in your tribe. So I don't know. It's sad.
Yeah.
It's like you're getting co-opted by this group, thinking that you're in control of it, but in a sense, like everything that you're doing is now just trying to raise your status within that new community.
That's actually really that last point you made is really interesting, because I think everyone is pretty familiar with this idea that, people, partisan ideologues, uh, let's just say that it's good business to be one.
Yeah. Oh,
If
yeah.
if you
Yeah.
if you pick a side and you lean in hard, and you can lean in really hard, and people are like,
Yeah.
This is great." You can look on Substack, and the most popular and successful writers on Substack, they have a lane,
Yeah.
and they are
Okay.
yeah, they're like
I saw
hard on
some
that lane.
I saw some stat on there that it was doing like this pie chart of people on Substack and what category they write under and how much money they
Yeah,
generate. The politics
yeah.
made up like almost half of the pie chart. They're just generating the most money out of any form of
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Like if you find someone with a purple check mark, is for people that aren't as familiar with Substack, it's 10,000, at least 10,000 paying subscribers. That'd be
yeah.
pretty cool. If I'd
That's
need
a lot of money. That's
a
nice.
lot more to get to that point. Yeah. But 10,000 paying subscribers, you look at the people that are at that point, and s- I would, maybe some of them, I would not go so far as to call them ideologues, but most of them I would call them that.
Yeah.
And, for better or worse, like maybe they're even right, but they
Uh-huh.
are ideologues preaching to their particular church choir, and they are, and whether or not they're even trying to expand the choir, and I dispute that they are, uh, no one is listening to them, because they like, everyone knows that they're the ideologues. So the people that like them are like, this person's great. They're going to them. They're giving their $5 or $10 a month or whatever. And the rest of them is
Yeah.
like, no. And I, and it's frustrating, because I think that's just ultimately, it's an extraordinarily unproductive way to go about politics, because you're getting away from the basic kind of issue, which is that you want to solve problems. You want the government to function well, and and work well for people, and it's a lot easier to do that, one, if you can expand your coalition. And so, I, you know, adopting techniques that make that more likely seem like a good idea. And then two, it's based on on a a very high sense of certainty,
Yeah.
and that, I think, that's just a major stumbling block to having real open conversations, where we're searching not for, or where it's not just us advocating for a particular point of view, but searching for truth, or searching for the best idea under the circumstances. If in politics we're not necessarily always going to be talking about an eternal, unchanging truth.
Yeah.
And but getting back to the point you raised about the status thing, it's like you see a lot of people who have been popular as ideologues.
Yeah.
Most of them stay as ideologues, but then if they start to transgress, you see some of these people that lose all their status entirely.
Yeah.
And now they're
Yeah.
they're on the outs, and maybe they'll gain some popularity with a new group, but with their old group, they're gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. Yeah,
Not
I think
yeah.
I do think I took it a little bit off track, but I remember one of your questions was about how do we get people to trust again, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, I was thinking about that as you were talking, and I don't know. I don't have a very good answer for
Hmm.
it, but I was just thinking that, the consequences of not having an institution that you belong to, that you can trust, will really have ramifications in the kind of person that you become, and so, I
Hmm.
mean, we're such an individualistic society that we all sort of want to have our own tribe that we essentially like kind of run, or we might not run it, but we're a part of it, and we feel like we're a very high-ranking member of that little tribe or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But becoming like a tribe unto yourself like that is not going to be very fulfilling in the long run, because it doesn't give you many parameters to walk through. It doesn't actually grant you a sense of community that leads to something more meaningful. It's hard to have a conversation with others if you're really like in your own tribe. You're not trying to see things the way that other people see things. You're not trying to actually have conversations that expand outside of your own borders, or your own understanding of reality or politics or spirituality. reality or anything like that. And I would assume that those things
Yeah.
are just going to have ramifications over time. I would even describe that that's pretty close to what I was in before I converted to Christianity, just being like, I have my own philosophy, I have my own tribe. I'm not going to commit to any institution that is beyond this because I think it's more comfortable this way. But just realizing over time that those things actually do kind of fold in on themselves. And we are going through a loneliness epidemic, obviously. It's one of the big
Mhm.
key words or buzz article type things that you can write right now if you're looking for like
Mhm.
something to get some clicks or something like
Gotta
that. I
get
feel like people
clicks.
want to yeah, I feel like people want to talk about the loneliness thing. But like
Yeah.
in reality, it's like the people who are actually genuinely lonely, like cutting themselves off from other people or cutting themselves off from a deeper community, that's not fun. That's not very healthy. And
Right.
over time, that's going to kick in. They're going to kind of realize that being their own tribe, like staying away and protecting themselves and preserving themselves from actual community is not going to, yield to many benefits in the long run. And so when it comes I do think on one end it's going to kind of uh, corrupt or implode on itself. Sorry, that's the better word, implode on itself. And at the same time, when it does implode and when we do have people who are actually longing for something deeper, they also they have to just trust that a community
Mm.
can help them, which is a very
Yeah.
it's kind of a strange thing, but Ernest Hemingway, he has this quote where he says, "The best way to find out if you can trust someone is to trust them." And
Oh,
it
yeah.
sounds like
Yeah.
it sounds like it's a circular argument, but the thing is, like, it's actually realistic. Like, this is something that
Yeah.
if you talk to a psychologist or a trauma
Did you
therapist or
use
something
that
like
in an
that.
article recently?
Yes, I did actually in
Okay.
a few months ago. A few months ago,
Okay. Yeah,
something
I
like
read it.
trusting in you. Okay,
Yeah.
I
It was
love
a good article. Everyone should
it.
read it.
Yeah, but that quote is burned into my brain, man. It's been burned into my brain for, like,
Yeah.
5 years because like, it's so true and so realistic. It's like, if you the only way to figure out if you can trust somebody is to trust them, and so going out on a limb,
Yeah.
actually trying to communicate with others is the only way to actually build trust, and so if you're looking for how to build hope for an institution, it actually has it's not like a I don't know, it's
Yeah.
not like a magic trick. It's like you actually have to trust and to go out on a limb and see if people are worthy of having your trust, right?
Yeah. That's funny because it sounds like, what you're I don't know, there's a degree. I mean, like, it kind of is circular to a degree, but, like, I totally get it, and it makes sense. I'm thinking about it, so, people that are so a couple of thoughts on this. So, with the loneliness epidemic, or really, I think, oh gosh, Derek Thompson, he wrote about it recently as less a loneliness epidemic and more an aloneness epidemic, which is a an important distinction in a sense, but I think it's like, even if you dispute that people are lonely because we're communicating a ton online and we have all these sweet things we can do at home. We can watch all these. We've got access to entertainment like we've never had before, and that's great. And there's this trend of people who are posting on TikTok. It's like plans got canceled, and they're stoked about it. And
Yeah,
I think that's actually a trend. I don't have TikTok, but I've read about it.
yeah, yeah. I
And
trust.
yeah, we're gonna assert it like it's gospel truth. Um, it's like you're absolutely right that a lot of these, well, like, humans are social animals, and a lot of these antisocial behaviors, even if in the moment they might seem just so appealing and exactly what you want to do, it's like, and it does often feel good when someone's like, you know what, I can't make it tonight. We're gonna have to do it some other time. And it's like, ah,
Yeah,
good. But it's rare that you do something, let's call it good, whether it's like social, or you do, you spend time with people, or you engage in an act of service, or you do something like, you work hard on something, you keep a goal, you actually do your homework and don't, have, or your work assignment, and you don't have Chat GPT do it, so you can do it in 10 minutes or whatever.
yeah,
No offense to people to do that. Well, some offense to people to do that.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
it's rare that you do one of those things and don't feel better after for having done it.
Yeah, I agree.
And
Yeah,
I think, yeah, and I think, we need thinking about this, this I think applies politically, it applies religiously, it applies to any institution. We do need people strongly making the case that people should should experiment with trust, should give it a go. And,
yeah,
it's like, yeah, okay, there have been mistakes made. The loss of trust was reasonable, justified. We get it. But it's like, it's going to be better if we trust. You just got to take a leap of faith. So
yeah.
you
Like
need some
exposure
compelling
therapy.
advocates. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or what do you mean by, wait, no, what do you mean by exposure therapy?
it's like it's pretty close to like a cognitive behavioral therapy. But if your
Mm,
patient is struggling with something, I think I had this one time where I
yes.
told a therapist that I was like, I'm struggling with caring what people think of me, and this part might have been
Mm.
pseudoscience, but she was like, I've heard that there's something that's correlated with the fear of heights and the fear of other people. So she was like, I want you to go rock climbing this week, and I do not know if there is actually any correlation between fear of people and then fear of heights. But all I know is that I went rock climbing that week with some friends that I hadn't seen in a while, and I felt better than I felt in like weeks. Right. So that's just
That
one
is the
example
coolest
of
thing.
yeah. So that's
Yeah.
one example of how exposure therapy could work. And so let's say you're a
Yeah.
therapist, well, I mean, even just outside of therapy, right? So, like, let's say you have a friends who you haven't talked with in a few years. They're very lonely. You could just give them a talk, be like, "Hey, I know it's uncomfortable, but I think the only way that you can actually get better here is to go out on a limb. Maybe attend a church, a small group. Even if they're like not
Yeah.
feeling religion or whatever, you could be like, join CrossFit gym or something like that. Just do like little things
Yeah.
to try to build a tiny little bit of community, and the more that you expose yourself to those kind of things, the stronger that they actually get.
Yeah. No, that's funny. You're absolutely right, and it reminds me that, like, in some of the physical sciences where we can run, really great experiments and everything, like we're pretty good. Like, just to give it an example, like take a car. It's like most of us don't understand a car well enough that we could actually build a car, but as a species, like we understand, like you press the gas pedal, and depending on the gear you're in, you're either going to go forwards or backwards. And if one of those things doesn't happen, it's like it's some mechanical problem. It's not a problem with the science. Like you're
Yeah,
not going to just be driving along and then you press the gas a little harder and then you fly straight up. Like we know that physically that's not going to happen.
yeah,
Whereas with a lot of psychology and brain science, like there's a lot that I don't know if we like really get. And so stuff that might seem like pseudoscience, like totally works.
I
Like I
know.
like
It is
you're
kind
just
of weird.
like, yeah. Like I have
Yeah,
no idea if the fear of heights correlates with fear of
yeah.
people
No,
or
I
whatever,
have no
but it
idea.
totally makes sense to me.
Yeah,
It totally makes sense to me that you'd go rock climbing with some friends and be like, yeah, no, I feel actually great.
yeah. No,
Yeah,
100%.
man.
And neither of us are medical experts, so anyone who's listening, please don't take this to
No,
heart or anything like that. But yeah,
no,
just
please do.
speculate,
But yeah,
just to speculate about it. It's fun.
yeah, man. Well, this has been good. I really don't have many other questions. I do want to just close with maybe a let's kind of go rapid fire on a couple of thoughts, or see if we can end someplace
Okay.
in terms of actionable insights. So I
Okay. Just
think
short
so.
answers.
You're coming from and let's like I'll say something, and then I want you to kind of give your input. So, well, actually, no. This is a question. This is actually a real question. So there are a lot of people for whom I'm asking you. You are on this podcast as a religious guest. You're an advocate for religion, but there are a lot of people that are going to listen, and it's like that is ultimately going to be a non-starter. Maybe
Yeah.
either they just have some antipathy for God, or whatever, or they had a specific experience with a church they left on purpose, and they're not going to be able to go back because maybe it wasn't that they were offended or whatever. It's like they have a doctrinal issue and they're not into it. Um,
Yeah.
can the good a religious community gives you be replicated elsewhere?
Oh man. So yeah, I mean that's a really super interesting question. So in theological circles, there's this phrase that's kind of used a lot called a common grace, which is essentially this idea that like
Hmm.
somebody who doesn't know God can get a benefit from doing certain spiritual practices just because the spiritual practices, even though they've disconnected them from God, the practices themselves still do have certain benefits. So, for example, lots of people
Hmm.
fast nowadays, regardless of your
Yeah.
religious background, and because there are certain
Yeah.
health benefits, well, and even like mental benefits to fasting, just the basic fortitude that someone has to go through in order to, you know, go to actually initiate a fast where you don't eat for 48 hours. That's hard, right? And so,
Oh
lots of
gosh.
people,
Yeah.
lots of people who are disjointed from any sort of religion will do that, and they will experience some benefits from it. And so, similarly to how community and ritual and stuff can have a amazing impact within the church, there are definitely ways that common graces can work themselves in communities that are detached from the church. I mentioned this just a second ago, but CrossFit is probably the most prospering type of community that I've ever seen. I've never been a
Mm.
part of CrossFit, but when I hear people talking about
Yeah.
CrossFit or their gym or the people that they hang out with, they almost talk about it with a religious fervor, right? And so I would
Yeah.
say
Yeah.
there's all, the, and I mean, it's so funny. I mean, there is like a ritual to it. Like you put on a specific
Yeah.
set of clothes, you eat a specific meal beforehand because you have to prep yourself for a workout. You have a specific meal afterwards. You uh, do a workout for this set amount of time. Anyways, so
Yeah.
that's extremely, it's a ritualistic community that people are actually bonding over. And so I like can respect that in the sense of, there are common graces that can operate within a community that are disjointed from God. But I mean, as a Christian,
Mm.
as somebody who believes these things are true and static and real and powerful and beautiful, I would say that it's not going to be as deep to the extent as a truly religious community that is practicing the way of Jesus together would be. But yeah, that's what I would say.
I think that's a terrific answer. And I think you hit on the importance of ritual. So I think I and this is and maybe this is even counsel for people that for whatever reason have decided to separate from religion. But
Yeah,
you know, it is it c- I would say it's important. I think it's a good idea to try and replicate like as you leave or as you try to throw out the bathwater, it's
yeah,
important, I think, to try and keep as much baby as you can, and I think you hit on a really important point with ritual. It's like humans, I think we derive a sense of safety from ritual, of meaning from
yeah,
ritual, and getting back to how I approach this from a political angle. I think we tend to have a healthier body politic when we have healthier people, and we have and I think part of that health is, like, not placing too much importance like, it's actually not treating politics like a religion, and I think so the more meaning that you can derive outside of politics while still remaining an engaged citizen, the better, I think,
yeah.
yeah,
It's like
and I yeah.
yeah, it's like treating like politics as a means rather than an end. So it's like
Yes.
your telos or your end goal is something
Mm,
that's ultimate outside of yourself that you technically don't have a ton of control over. But the
yeah.
means is politics, right? So end goal,
Mm.
you know, your religion, your faith, whatever you know, is going to happen in that regard. And then politics is just a little bit of a means. So when you treat it like that, it won't become ultimate, I would hope at least, right?
Yeah. Last question. What and I think I might know the answer for this, so, give whatever answer you'd like, but what I often end these interviews, when I remember, by asking what gives people hope?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Uh, I mean, just one of the answers that I'm just thinking about right now is just children. I mean, it's so hard
Hmm.
to I mean, I've an amazing niece and nephew, just beautiful kids. They're so
Mhm.
funny, so full of life. And it is so hard to hang out with them and just not feel a sense of hope. I mean, they are just innocent and pure and full of joy and wonder. I mean, even just that, the basic sense of wonder and awe that they feel at just these little tiny things, right? Like my nephew just building a Lego and just acting like it's the greatest thing that's ever happened to him. That alone just provides so much hope. And even, yeah, like if you know your listeners are like, oh, I don't want to commit to a religious framework or something like that, it is so amazing just to see children, right? Like there's so much hope
Yeah.
just in watching them. It's beautiful, you know. And there actually has been a bunch of like psychological studies about this too, about how to produce happiness. One of them is just to hang around
Mhm.
children, you know, like just see the wonder that they have.
Yeah. That's a great answer. And I really like that you gave it. As a father of a young kid, it rings true. And I 100% thought you were just gonna say Jesus, which would have been a good answer too, but, I like,
That would've been a cop
saying
out.
children.
Like, I
Yeah.
have to say that.
Yeah, right. That was really good, and I think that's a great place to end. So, Griffin Gooch has been awesome talking to you.
It's been so fun. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.